It's really wonderful to see all of you. I'm Jim McAdams, and I'm the director of the Nanovic Institute. I thank you for coming out on a Thursday night, which I know has special significance now for some seniors on campus. And so for those of you who are here, a double thank you. I'm delighted to open our ceremony here tonight for the Laura Shannon Book Prize. This is the second year that we've given the prize, and it's something that we do that we're just very, very proud of. In particular because of the people who have made this award possible, who are, if I may, sitting right here, Laura and Mike Shannon. Who are really committed to Notre Dame and to European studies at Notre Dame. And you know, Laura came to me at one point and she said, I want to do something really serious for the Nanovic. Something that, you know, people will really understand the importance of it for scholarship and for students. And she said, what about having some kind of prize, like a book prize? And I thought it was just such a fantastic idea. It just made complete sense in the mix of things that we're trying to do at the Institute. And what's important about this prize is it's not just, you know, somebody writes a good book and then they get the prize, and that's the end of it. But this prize represents for us a concept, which is that you can study all different aspects of European history, culture, society, and politics, and figure out ways, for whatever period you study, for whatever country you focus on, to make that subject relevant for all of us, really meaningful for all of us. And so that's why we've, at Laura and Mike's suggestion, created this prize. This prize has already become a big deal, even though we're only on the second year of actually awarding it. It's a long process. It's not something that somebody takes lightly. And we anticipate that this will be the biggest European Studies prize in the United States. I mean, we don't just anticipate that. We know that it will be. And that says something also about the quality of our recipient tonight, whom I will not be introducing, but instead I will turn this honor over to the one and only Felipe, who our Mesto, who will extend some words about our guest. So thank you for coming, Felipe. So there is this microphone here, and there's some connection between it and our recording.
Oh no, I certainly won't use the microphone. Everybody wants to get on and hear the lecturer. The sooner I'm out of the way, the better. But you know, it's going to be difficult to do this briefly because I have to recount all the lecturer's virtues, which will take a long time, and also, you know, pay tribute to those of the, you know, munificent benefactors who are our reason for being here tonight, who are Mike and Laura. You know, one of the great pleasures and privileges of being at Notre Dame is that we have, you know, people like Mike and Laura to commune with, who love the university and who, even more surprisingly, trust us to be, you know, the guardians and bestowers of their munificence and the fruits of their labour. And also, you know, I do also have to, you know, pay tribute to the guys at the Nanovic Institute who've done so much work to make an event like this possible. So thanks very much to you and your team. But, you know, I suppose the biggest treat for me, apart from sharing the evening with all my colleagues and students who might like and admire, the biggest treat is obviously being able to introduce the winner of the 2011 Laura Shannon Prize and the 2012 Laura Shannon Lecturer, who are, of course, the same person. It's very hard to win a prize like this, because on the short list of something like this, you always have a lot of great work. And it's not enough, to have painstaking scholarship and impeccable research and searching questions and cogent prose. That's the minimum, you expect that in any academic work. You need some extra, some really special qualities. And for the sake of brevity, I'll just pick out two of the many extra special qualities that tonight's lecturer's work has. I think I'd mention, first of all, the quality which to me really marks out the difference between good writing in history of the social and political sciences and average writing, which is an extra quality of vividness that comes from consummate mastery of the sources and a real sense of evidence. There isn't a page, I would say there's hardly a paragraph in Tara's work which isn't enlivened and enriched by really gripping and vivid allusions to the sources. And to have that mastery and that deftness in handling the material are just the qualities which it's shaming for an old person like me to see so consummately achieved in a young historian like our lecturer this evening. I've spent a lifetime trying to cultivate this skill, and he's already got it. And I think the second great quality that I draw attention to is that power of adding something new to one's appreciation, one's sense of the subject. And tonight's lecturer does this really in two ways, principally. First of all, she's got a really audacious and novel perspective, which in the case of the book that won the Shannon Prize is it's a marginal, it's a liminal perspective. It's the perspective of children, and it's the perspective of the inhabitants of borderlands. Instead of the metropolitan skylines from which people conventionally approach the history of nationalism. And that's a tremendously enriching experience to read her work, because it takes one into the world of ordinary people and makes apparent what it meant to be a child and just a kind of ordinary person in the Czech and German borderlands of a relatively long period which she studies, because these people were victims of the nationalism that they were trying to resist. And it not only is her work focused on marginal people, it's also focused on these frontier cultures. But I think that if you really want to understand what happened in history, you need to go to those borders, you need to go to those margins, you need to go to those frontiers, which are the places where states and empires and civilizations, which are the tectonic plates of European history, kind of scraped against each other and generated seismic effects. And I think that tonight's lecturer's work is pioneering in this respect, and that in the future we'll see historians more and more deserting the high-level analysis from the metropolitan perspective and going to the kind of worlds that tonight's lecturer has explored. Now, the second way in which she enriches our understanding is by, I suppose, subverting, our traditional notions of a subject on which almost everybody has already made up his or her mind, which is nationalism. And it's really stunning to read tonight's lecturer's work and to find that there's this whole culture which he describes as, what's your term for it? It's this just resistance to nationalism, which is far more characteristic of most of the people who lived in the Czech and German borderlands in the period studied than we've tradition is supposed, and the whole myth of nationalism, or the whole romantic myth of nationalism bubbling up, from low social levels, is challenged by tonight's lecturer's work. It's a disputable thesis, but it's fresh. It's challenging. It makes one see things differently from the way one saw them before, and therefore it enhances life. And that to me is perhaps the ultimate quality by which one should judge academic work. When, if I'm allowed to say this, Jim, when Jim tells the story of how when he telephoned tonight's lecturer to tell her that she'd won the prize, he was aghast to find that she'd already won 5 other prizes for the same night. But the amazing thing is that those prizes were all for kind of regional history. They're all, the best book about Czech history, the best book about Old Habsburg Empire, the best book about Central European history. But the point about this, this subversive power of tonight's lecturer's work is that it really does illuminate the whole history of Europe. And that's why I think it's going to be a beacon for the way that people are going to study the subject in the future. And when I say this brings me to a sort of final thing that I perhaps shouldn't say. But how could I get through even the briefest appearance before an audience at Notre Dame without saying something that I shouldn't? It's not necessary for academic work to have contemporary resonance. It's not necessary for it to be relevant or present. But sometimes, just by accident, it is. And it gives one, it's kind of new direction for one's own place in the world. And, this kind of work that tonight's lecturer has done, illuminating a world in which bilingualism was the project of ordinary people and was frustrated by elite ideology. It's so important for us today. It's important for, us, meaning us in Europe, because we're trying to construct a multilingual union. And dare I say, it's important for us here in the United States, where we desperately need to buck that kind of linguistic nationalism and embrace diversity and, particularly embrace here, now, the kind of bilingualism which the people whom tonight's lecturer has studied in the Czech and German borderlands in the late 19th and 20th centuries espouse as their own project. I feel very, very honoured to be able to ask you to join me in welcoming to Notre Dame the 2011 Shannon Prize winner and the 2012 Shannon lecturer, Zahra.
Is this okay? Okay. I feel like I almost need a minute or an hour to gather my thoughts after that introduction, which I'm now incredibly afraid that I won't be able to live up to. I'm incredibly thrilled to be here tonight and to have received this honor. And I'm incredibly thrilled to have the chance to share some of my ideas and my work with all of you. This prize actually has very special meaning to me because I've always aspired to write about European history, to write about East European history and teach East European history in a way that does sort of transcend the boundaries of the nation state, and that's the purpose of this prize. The idea that I could enhance life on top of that is well above and beyond my wildest aspirations, but this is really an incredibly special prize and an incredibly special honor. I want to personally thank Mrs. Laura Shannon and Mike Shannon for endowing this prize and for supporting the humanities and social sciences at a time when funding is being cut everywhere. I know this will be a tremendous boost to my own research and to that of many other scholars in the future. So it's an incredible gift. And of course, I want to thank the Nanovic Institute, Jim McAdams, and especially Monica Caro, who organized this event and my visit here so fantastically and perfectly. And then finally, thanks to all of you, even the students who may be here because you have to be, for coming out after dinner to listen to me. I hope that I can make it worthwhile. When I finished Kidnapped Souls, the book that was awarded this prize, I basically thought I was finished with nationalism. I was really sick of nationalism. And of course, writing about indifference to nationalism is one way to challenge nationalism's grip on history and on the way that we write and think about history. But another way to do that is just to tell other stories altogether, to talk about something else, to get away from the basic idea that all that ever happened in Central and Eastern Europe is nationalism, nationalist conflict, ethnic conflict. So I set out to write a book about the history of displaced children and families in post-war Europe. I don't know, naively thinking somehow this would get me away from the terrain of nationalism. And I was particularly interested in the way in which the reconstruction of families that had been shattered and divided by war was linked to the reconstruction of European civilization at large in the aftermath of total war. I was also interested in thinking across the Cold War boundaries that typically structure the field of European history in general. So between 1945 and 1948 in particular, you have a moment when the divisions that eventually that divided all of Europe for half of a century were really not yet in place, and East and West European societies were facing a lot of common challenges as they set out to rebuild their families and their societies. So in the end, unfortunately, I completely failed to escape nationalism. Instead, I ended up writing about the stubborn persistence of nationalism, the opposite of national indifference, even in the aftermath of fascism and genocide, even in the aftermath of cataclysms that you think might have discredited the hold of the grip of nationalism on European societies. So for this talk, I decided to try and take a step back and think a little more broadly and synthetically about the place of nationalism in one of the most avowedly apolitical of institutions, the international humanitarian organizations that emerged to save the children from the ravages of total war in the 20th century. And what I found in my research is that even as these organizations and activists proclaimed a new era of internationalism, individualism, and human rights after the Second World War, they simultaneously anchored nationalist assumptions in the new institutions that would shape the post-war world. In 1948, for example, the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide labeled, quote, forcibly transferring children of one group to another group, enacted with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, as a form of genocide. At the very same moment, a right to a nationality was enshrined in the 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights, along with the principle that, quote, no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality, nor denied the right to change his nationality. Much closer to the ground, Vanita Lewis, a social worker who was working with the International Refugee Organization in Germany, the main United Nations agency responsible for caring for refugees, proclaimed in 1948, quote, the lost identity of individual children is the social problem of the day on the continent of Europe. Even if his future destiny lies in a country other than that of his origin, he, the displaced child, is entitled to the basic human right of full knowledge of his background and origin. Children were at the symbolic heart of efforts to reconstruct Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. International humanitarian workers, government officials, and child welfare experts were particularly concerned about the fate of what they called lost children, hundreds of thousands of children who had been separated from their parents by bombs, forced labor, deportation, and murder. As the above quotations suggest, these lost children were endowed with a human right to a nationality after the Second World War. Repatriating them to the countries of their origin and renationalizing them, teaching them what was seen to be their lost nationality, was essential not only to the psychological rehabilitation of individual youth, but also to the reconstruction of European civilization at large, in the eyes, at least, of both humanitarian activists and government officials. But my question is, where did this strikingly nationalist conception of human rights come from? Because when we think of human rights, we tend to think of something that transcends the nation state, at least in theory. And what does this story tell us about the relationships between nationalism and internationalism, individualist and collectivist values and ideals in the aftermath of Nazi rule? I want to argue today that the histories of humanitarianism and ethnic cleansing in particular have been deeply entangled in the 20th century, and that children were central to both. Humanitarian activism to save the children was more than just a simple response to mass violence in the 20th century. From the Armenian genocide to the aftermath of the Second World War, humanitarian organizations have often, sometimes inadvertently and sometimes advertently, been complicit in the logic of nation building and even ethnic cleansing, and have themselves contributed to the construction of nationally homogenous states in Europe. This is a story that I think also challenges conventional understandings of the liberation of Europe in 1945 as a moment of triumph for liberal democracy, internationalism, individualism, and human rights in Western Europe, the so-called idea of a 0 hour where everything started anew and a new and better world was created. Mark Mazauer, for example, has observed that in the post-war West after World War II, quote, "The struggle against Hitler had revealed the importance of human and civil rights. In the legal and political sphere, in other words, the trend was to reassert the primacy of the individual vis-a-vis the state." And it is certainly true that United Nations relief workers and other humanitarian workers, along with European policymakers and child welfare experts, often framed their activism around displaced children, around refugee children, using an individualist rhetoric of human rights and children's so-called best interest after World War II. But international organizations and policymakers simultaneously upheld the nation-state as the very basis of European reconstruction. In practice, moreover, humanitarian workers on the ground didn't aim to rehabilitate displaced persons or displaced children as abstract individuals. They targeted refugees in different ways depending on whether they were children or adults, Jews or Christians, French, German, Russians, or Poles. In the process, they defined both human rights and children's best interests in sharply nationalist terms. Nationalist and internationalist impulses were, in fact, deeply entangled in post-war reconstruction efforts. On the one hand, a whole host of new international organizations and conventions promised to usher in a new era of international cooperation and to uphold universal values and laws that transcended state borders. The foot soldiers of post-war relief efforts were themselves often animated and motivated by this spirit. Susan Pettis, who was a United Nations social worker in Europe, recalled joining the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which I'll refer to as UNRWA in the rest of this talk, with the hopeful conviction that, quote, "the chaos immediately following the end of World War I, with clogged roads, epidemics, widespread hunger, could not be repeated. We would, this time, achieve a permanent peace and help establish a unified world." But the liberation of Europe was at the same time an explosively and violently nationalist moment. The experience of Nazi occupation in Europe had bolstered the conviction that only the protection of national sovereignty and the creation of nationally homogenous states could actually guarantee lasting peace and security. That logic was most dramatically expressed in the violent expulsion of 12 million Germans from Eastern Europe, basically under the with the conviction that if there was any kind of, if the Germans remained, they would rise again, and violence would be the result. But Reconstruction was more generally framed as an effort to recover the national sovereignty and restore the national honor that had been compromised by Nazi occupation. This project was brutally gendered since the sovereignty of the nation was often located in the bodies of both women and children. So across Europe, women who had been suspected of consorting with occupying soldiers were often publicly and violently humiliated at the end of the war in spectacles of retribution. Women who had slept with German soldiers in France, for example, had their heads shaved and were paraded through the streets. And just as post-war governments and individuals demanded the restitution of apartments, bank accounts, and artwork that had been plundered by the Nazi regime, they also demanded the return of children who were understood as a precious form of national patrimony. Pronatalist policies also found favor across Europe. It's probably not surprising that in the wake of an obscene number of military and civilian casualties, European policymakers were very anxious to repopulate after the Second World War. Compensating for lost lives had particular significance and urgency for European Jews after the Holocaust, but every European government was anxious to replace lost soldiers and civilians, recover missing children, and secure the labor that they believed was necessary for economic reconstruction. These concerns ultimately fueled competition among European governments to claim displaced children as future citizens. In 1946, Pierre Famelin, who at the time was representing the French Ministry of Public Health and Population, described refugee children as a, quote, blood transfusion who could counter a menace of extinction that threatened the French nation. He argued, quote, during the war years, Germany was an immense prison where human beings belonging to all of the nations of Europe rubbed shoulders. This mixing of humans without historical precedent has left human traces. Children were born, a lot of children. A good number of them have French blood in their veins. From a demographic point of view, the child is the ideal immigrant because he constitutes a human asset whose value is all the more certain since his assimilation is guaranteed. It is impossible to say the same of any adult immigrant. So he's practically salivating over orphaned and refugee children as a potential source of demographic renewal for France. The resettlement of refugees and displaced persons after World War II ultimately represented a foundational moment in the development of post-war migration policies more broadly. Both Eastern and West European governments aimed to create homogenous nation-states in the name of national security after the Second World War. Their migration policies, whether they were directed toward expelling undesirable Germans and Jews, preventing emigration, bringing exiled citizens home, or recruiting foreign labor, were all directed in one way or another toward this goal. And because so much post-war relief work revolved around the repatriation and resettlement of refugees, international humanitarian and human rights workers often became, whether inadvertently or purposely, deeply implicated in this nationalizing project. One way to think about the extent of both continuity and change after 1945 is to return to 1918. So that's what I want to do for a second here. If we step back to the aftermath of the First World War, which generated the very first wave of international humanitarian intervention that was focused specifically on saving children, it's clear that several of the assumptions that underpin post-World War II humanitarian work were already in place between the wars. It was during the First World War, and especially the Armenian genocide, that children first became both spoils of war and objects of international efforts to renationalize them in the name of universal values. In 1921, the League of Nations launched an unprecedented mission to rescue children who had been separated from their parents and their nation during the Armenian genocide. Children were lost during the genocide in many ways. Thousands simply starved and died along routes of deportation. Others were raped, forced into servitude, sold into concubinage, or forcibly abducted from their relatives. When caravans of Armenians stopped to rest in Turkish towns, groups of Kurds and Turks would often appear to take their pick of Armenian children. In 1922, the League of Nations established the Commission for the Protection of Women and Children in the Near East. That commission operated branches in Constantinople and in Aleppo, Syria until 1927. And its official mission was to reclaim the tens of thousands of Armenian women and children who had allegedly been abducted, denationalized, and Islamicized in Turkish families and institutions. In the Commission's first report to the League, it estimated that 90,000 Armenian orphans had already been reclaimed from Turkish families and institutions, and that another 75,000 women and children remained in captivity. That was their language. The Commission was officially politically, nationally, and religiously neutral, but its work clearly reflected the concerns of Western feminist organizations and Christian missionaries. In fact, the YWCA was one of the major forces behind the creation of the organization. Continuing a long tradition, the League interpreted the Islamicization of Armenian women and children as an assault on Christian civilization by barbarian Turks. In a report submitted to the League of Nations Assembly on September 21st, 1922, a commission member alleged, quote, "Children torn from the Christian faith are often forced by ill treatment to disown even the little they remember of their past life. Their birth certificates are forged and their true names are replaced by Turkish names. It is almost impossible to get at them, as an entire people is an accomplice to this crime." And in fact, many Armenian women and children who were reclaimed by the commission had in fact been violently abducted. But the story was often more complicated. In other cases, many other children and women were actually well integrated into Muslim families. And many Armenian children had entered Turkish families through less nefarious channels. As they fled persecution, some Armenians sought to save their children by entrusting them to or hiding them with Turkish families and institutions, just as Jewish families would attempt to hide their children among Christians several decades later. In other cases, Turkish charitable organizations gathered abandoned Armenian children along the routes of deportation. A large number of Armenian children formed close bonds to their Turkish foster parents and then had to be removed from them by the League of Nations by force. It's not coincidental that children and grown women were lumped together in the League's rescue efforts. Stories about the kidnapping of Armenian women and children during the genocide built on much earlier scripts of captivity narratives in which women and children were abducted and ultimately converted by non-Christians such as Native Americans in colonial America. But 20th century captivity narratives also built on a nationalist tradition which depicted both women and children as a form of national property. Both women and children, moreover, were considered generally incapable of making their own decisions about their future, about where they wanted to go after the war. Members of the League Commission were hard-pressed to acknowledge that Armenian women or children, some of which who were youth or young adults, might have formed genuine ties to the Turkish community. Commission member Emma Cushman denounced, quote, "the unique and very clever manner in which the Turks contrived to conceal the identity of these children." She conceded that many Armenian women and children ran away after being rescued to return to their Turkish families, but insisted that these runaways suffered from a, quote, "distorted mentality," and blamed surreptitious visits or communication from the Turkish family, who either brought or sent some tidbits of food or a present of some kind. The League of Nations also established neutral houses for Armenian women and children, sort of like safe houses. And in the neutral house and affiliated schools in Aleppo, the Commission explicitly aimed to renationalize, re-Christianize, and re-civilize lost Armenians. One Commission member reported in August of 1924, "It's hard to believe your eyes when you compare the people in rags, dirty and of a savage bearing, who arrive here with the more or less civilized people who leave us a few months later. At first, our protégés often tend to try to run away, but soon the Armenian within begins to reappear. Before they leave us, they are completely returned to their nationality." The League Commission ended its work in Constantinople in 1926 and in Aleppo in 1927, and at the end of the day, some 8,000 children and adults received aid from the League during its period of operation. These were, of course, very modest numbers, but I think that the striking continuities between these efforts and post-World War II efforts to reclaim both East European and Jewish children suggest the extent to which interwar conceptions of collective rights, minority rights, were absorbed into post-war visions of human rights. The League's mission in the Near East also underscores the centrality of the transfer of children in general to 20th century experiences of war, displacement, and genocide, as well as to reconstruction in the aftermath of war and genocide. It reveals the way in which victimized children, in particular, justified new forms of international humanitarian activism, and the extent to which that intervention could, at times, serve nationalist goals. After the Second World War, international organizations and European policymakers organized the search for lost children on a much, much larger scale. Among Jewish organizations, of course, the recovery of what were called hidden children from Christian families and institutions was immediately linked to the memory of the dead and to the regeneration of the Jewish community. As in Armenia, however, the problem was that some guardians of hidden Jewish children were often reluctant to relinquish their wards. They'd become attached to them in some cases, in many cases. In Poland, the Education Department of the Central Committee of Jews in Poland reported bitterly that many Poles would only return Jewish children for a considerable price. The ransoms demanded by Polish foster parents were actually inflated by a bidding war that erupted on the ground between competing Jewish organizations, some of which were Zionist and some of which were non-Zionist. And there was kind of a going rate that you essentially had to pay to foster parents to get a child back. Custody disputes were also extremely numerous in France, where up to 10,000 Jewish children were saved by Catholic families in hiding from the Nazis. The most famous case was the Finley affair, which inflamed long-standing tensions between Catholic and secular camps in post-war France, and which dominated the headlines for several months in 1953. A lot of people were calling it the New Dreyfus Affair. In that case, Antoinette Brune, the Catholic foster mother of 2 hidden Jewish boys, defied French court orders to return the boys to their surviving aunts. She instead secretly baptized them and then ferried them over the Pyrenees to hide them in French monasteries. With time, it became evident that the actual number of surviving Jewish children was tragically small in Europe. The number of hidden children was wildly exaggerated by Jewish organizations in a way out of what turned out to be misplaced hope that more children had survived than was the reality. But of course, these small numbers only amplified the stakes. In an appeal to the Vatican in March of 1946, Rabbi Isaac Herzog, who was then the chief rabbi of Palestine, explained, quote, "As of today, every child signifies for us 1,000 children." The loss and recovery of children was clearly central to 20th century experiences of genocide. And yet, I think it would be misleading to see denationalization as a step on a slippery slope to extermination. Raphael Lemkin, who authored the 1948 Genocide Convention, famously insisted that the cultural assimilation of one minority group by another, represented by a majority group, represented what he called cultural genocide. In reality, however, Nazi racial planners sought to Germanize only those children that they believed could become Germans through assimilation. It was precisely those minority groups, like Jews and Roma, who were deemed biologically incapable of assimilation, who were targeted for annihilation. A perceived link between denationalization and biological destruction nonetheless resonated widely after the war. East European officials in particular deliberately conflated denationalization and genocide as they sought to place themselves at the top of an imagined hierarchy of victims and to equate themselves with Jewish victims of the Holocaust. And as Cold War tensions intensified, this became an even greater pattern as East European governments started to accuse American authorities and international organizations of aiding and abetting denationalization. A 1948 Polish memo to the International Refugee Organization asserted, quote, "In violating all of the laws of humanity and stomping on human rights, the Germans organized in a systematic fashion unique to themselves the kidnapping of children in pursuit of a double goal, the biological reinforcement of their own nation and the biological destruction of the defeated population, who according to their plans were condemned to complete extermination." In some respects, as Mark Mazauer has recently argued, Lemkin's vision of cultural genocide as an international crime reflected the last gap of an old order. Lemkin's basic goal was to resuscitate the interwar League of Nations with stronger enforcement of minority rights protection, like the kind that had been enforced by the League of Nations between the wars. The great powers saw this interwar regime of minority rights as a destabilizing force, and they opposed any attempt to transpose minority rights into the new international order. So the Genocide Convention was only ratified once the whole idea of cultural genocide had been struck from the text. Significantly, however, many East European delegates in particular supported the concept of cultural genocide. A Czech representative to the United Nations specifically invoked Hitler's, quote, "gigantic plan for the complete Germanification of the Czech nation" in support of the clause. And if we examine the practices of United Nations workers in the field, as well as the rhetoric of both Jewish and East European policymakers, it's clear that aspects of Lemkin's vision, which I think was itself a product of an East European culture of collective rights, did survive in post-war Europe, and that they were integrated into post-war understandings of human rights and humanitarianism. Private Jewish agencies led efforts to reclaim Jewish children from Christian families after the Holocaust. But the search for lost children was also taken up by the United Nations itself, along with East European governments. The major responsible agencies were the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, and its successor, the International Refugee Organization. UNRWA and the IRO took up the search for East European children in the British and American zones of occupied Germany and Austria. They basically created what they called child search teams, which traveled all throughout the German countryside and aimed to find, reclaim, renationalize, and eventually repatriate lost East European children. And they did all of this in the name of democratization, justice, and human rights, as well as in what they believed was the psychological best interests of the children themselves. Here it might actually be useful to stop for a moment and give you a bit of background on how children became lost in the first place during World War II. When the Nazis overran Eastern Europe during the Second World War, they did in fact attempt to enrich their demographic power through the Germanization of Slavic children who were deemed to possess German blood. The Nazi regime's use of the term re-Germanization to describe what basically was a scavenger hunt for German blood had deep historical roots. During and after the Second World War, Nazi officials justified Germanization policies as kind of a form of restitution for alleged losses to the German population through interwar Czechification, Polonization, Slovenization, so on in East Central Europe. Actual efforts to forcibly Germanize children in Eastern Europe met with a fair amount of resistance and spotty success. But after the war, East Europeans remembered the Germanization of children as one of the Nazi regime's greatest crimes. Stories of children who had been stolen or kidnapped from Eastern Europe circulated widely in the press. East European officials also wildly exaggerated the number of children reportedly kidnapped by the Nazis. So the Polish government, for example, declared that at least 200,000 Polish children had fallen victim to Germanization during the Second World War, whereas historians have more credibly estimated that around 20,000 were kidnapped from Poland and up to 50,000 from all of Europe. But precise numbers are, of course, very difficult to come by, as they depend on the definition of Germanization itself in a context in which national loyalties were often ambiguous. Some East European parents, for example, voluntarily applied for German citizenship and Germanized their own children. Others abandoned their children to German families and institutions while they were working as forced laborers in Germany or living in displaced persons camps after the war. East European officials in the 1940s would not have distinguished between a child who had been kidnapped from his or her parents, an abandoned Slavic child placed with a German family for adoption, or a child Germanized by his or her parents. According to the logic of the time, children could be kidnapped not only from their parents, but also from the nation, from the national collective. UN social workers at least officially claim to stand above these kinds of nationalist concerns. In an expression of their individualist ethic, they pledge to uphold the best interests of the child as the guiding principle of child welfare. And the whole idea of the best interest principle in and of itself, and the casework method with which it was associated, where they would investigate each child's individual circumstances and make a decision accordingly, was intended to repudiate Nazi racial hierarchies. Focusing on the best interests of an individual child in deciding his or her placement implied the rejection of other potential criteria for making child welfare policies, like the goal of creating a master race or the goal of creating model socialist citizens. But the meaning of these best interests was, of course, not at all transparent. Based on the belief that children's psychological rehabilitation depended on the cultivation of a firm national identity, UN social workers, as well as European governments, ultimately came to define the individual best interests of displaced children in distinctly nationalist terms. Several factors explain the focus on renationalizing lost children among United Nations humanitarian workers. First of all, it was pragmatic. Access to basic necessities like food and housing, resettlement and citizenship rights all depended on nationality. A central job of United Nations workers on the ground was to actually classify refugees into different groups. This was not an easy thing to do, especially when you had Americans and Brits who had no knowledge of foreign languages. There were stories of Jewish refugees headed to Palestine who claimed that they were Greeks, and nobody, really knew the difference. But in any event, it was their job to classify refugees into different groups, each of which had access to different privileges and rights. The UN also organized DP camps along national lines in order to facilitate repatriation and also to avoid national conflicts, which unfortunately became necessary. There were pogroms in some of the post-war refugee camps because of ongoing tensions between Jews and Poles, for example. But the nationalization of refugees was more than just a necessary evil in the eyes of relief workers. As we've seen, I think it continued a logic of humanitarian intervention that had been already established by the League of Nations after the First World War, when the League Commission in the Near East linked the renationalization of Armenian children to its universal and humanitarian mission. Western relief workers also learned something on the ground in Europe. Initially, a lot of UN workers who were actually very troubled by the nationalist organization of relief work, but many gradually changed their minds. In the words of UNRWA child welfare worker Susan Pettis, quote, "At first, I couldn't understand why the Army and UNRWA almost immediately set up different camps for Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, Western Europeans, etc. Imbued with the idealistic sense of one world, I felt disillusioned when that unity didn't materialize right away. I soon realized, however, that for both psychological and practical reasons, national grouping is best during the insecure and traumatic times in the lives of the displaced." So emerging ideals of human rights and relief in post-war Europe were not just imposed from above by Allied occupation authorities and humanitarian organizations. They were also informed, I think, by long-standing pedagogical and political practices on the ground in Central and Eastern Europe. In the case of Jewish refugee children, for example, a lot of humanitarian workers who were initially quite skeptical gradually became convinced of the merits of Zionist forms of education and Zionist solutions. Beginning in 1946, in the aftermath of the Kielce pogrom in Poland, some 200,000 East European Jews fled into the American zone of Germany, hoping to move on to Palestine. Many children and youth came in kibbutzim, in youth groups, essentially, on their own, even though they actually still had living parents or relatives back in Poland. So American and British social workers were initially really skeptical about the separation of these Jewish youth from their families. Conflicts over the relative merits of Zionist education and familial care for Jewish children erupted in a heated debate in a 1947 meeting of the UN Jewish Child Care Committee. One representative of the American Joint Distribution Committee claimed that kibbutzim were actually preferable to family life. He argued, "The group leaders are much better for the children than a disturbed mother or father in a DP camp." UN social workers were initially very unsympathetic to this view. In one 1948 memo, an IRO child welfare officer concluded in frustration, quote, "In view of the utter disparity between IRO's commitments towards unaccompanied children and their relatives and the accepted Jewish principle whereby an orphan always belongs to the community, it is obvious that our aims will always be completely at variance." But in spite of these initial reservations, many UN workers gradually embraced the Zionist solution. Some social workers were simply persuaded by encounters with Jewish youth who themselves passionately had set their sights on Palestine. UNRWA officials also came to support the education of Jewish youth in kibbutzim for pragmatic reasons. Relocating Jewish youth to kibbutzim and training farms freed up space in overcrowded camps, and they seemed to serve a rehabilitative function at a moment when surviving Jewish youth were widely seen as morally and psychologically debilitated. UNRWA and IRO workers were even more passionate in their determination to renationalize East European children. A central mission of UNRWA's child search teams was basically to comb the German countryside in search of Germanized children. Simply identifying these children required tremendous detective work, since many of these children had left home at a very young age and had no memory whatsoever of their language of origin or of their parents. In 1947, Jean Henshaw described Polish and Yugoslav children in one UN Children's Center who had, quote, renounced their country, language, and culture and vehemently claimed that they were Germans. Once identified, UN child search officers sought to remove these children from German families as quickly as possible. And so, in some cases, this children were removed from German parents by force. Custody battles over these displaced children generated bitter tensions between the United Nations, Allied military officials, East European governments, German foster parents, who of course didn't want to give up the kids, and displaced persons themselves. In the name of the best interests of the children, British and American military authorities, as opposed to humanitarian officials, often argued that the children should be left in their German homes. They insisted basically that they would be emotionally scarred by yet another upheaval and by removal from their foster parents. Increasingly, of course, Allied military authorities also started to object to the repatriation of children to Eastern Europe for more political reasons, namely out of anti-communist sympathies. The idea was that you didn't want to send a child back behind the Iron Curtain. UNRWA and IRO child welfare officers, however, consistently favored removing displaced children from German homes and repatriating them to Eastern Europe. In 1948, Eileen Davidson, who was then a chief of the IRO's Child Search Section, argued that this policy represented the best interests of the child from a psychological, moral, and political perspective. Her argument rested on the conviction that German society had not yet been purged of racism, so the possibility of true integration for any East European child was slim. East European children left in Germany, she concluded, would suffer permanent psychological damage even if they were loved and well cared for. Quote, far from securing the best interests of the child, one has to run the danger with the passage of years of contributing to the development of a warped and twisted personality, a misfit with roots neither here nor in his home country. And Davidson's position was very typical of United Nations social workers at the time. It reflects the way that they use developmental psychology to essentially square the circle between their individualist ideals and nationalist policies, as they basically define children's individual psychological needs in nationalist terms. These views also shape the pedagogical practices within refugee camps and children's homes. In the International Children's Village in Trogen, Switzerland, for example, 132 orphans were housed in 8 distinctive national houses, each appropriately decorated and furnished in national style. A teacher in the village boasted, quote, it is amazing to observe with what toughness and vitality even the smallest group preserves its national character if soundly organized. In each of these small colonies, the very best elements of national culture come to the fore. The cultivation of each child's national identity was essential to his or her psychological well-being, Therese Bross concluded, writing for UNESCO in 1947. In the course of our visit to the children's communities, we saw indeed how much the children need a country of their own if they are to be psychologically normal. The all-important requirement for children who have been moved from one country to another, to settle the child and provide him with a country of his own and a language and culture which that implies. These efforts to recover East European and Jewish children after World War II suggest striking continuities in ideas about humanitarian relief and human rights across the two world wars. I think that in a way, in a sort of paradoxical way, lost children were simultaneously victims and beneficiaries of the drive to create nationally homogeneous states. On the one hand, the perceived ability of children to learn new languages, new religions, and new identities quickly saved many of their lives, both during the Armenian Genocide and the Second World War and the Holocaust. But this ability to assimilate was a double-edged sword. In a world of warring nationalist movements and a world of population politics where nation-states basically wanted to have as many people as possible, it also transformed children into a form of wartime plunder to be captured and remodeled by nations that were looking to expand their ranks. Ethnic cleansing and humanitarianism were also deeply entangled in migration policies from the 1930s onward. One fundamental goal of these policies in both Eastern and Western Europe was to create homogeneous nation states. That meant that children who were seen as malleable and assimilable were generally privileged. This logic, for example, was at the heart of the Kindertransports from Nazi Germany and Austria in 1938 and 39. In the context of the Great Depression, the admission of Jewish children was far more palatable to British authorities and the British public than the admission of their parents, who were considered culturally and economically undesirable. And so 18,000 children escaped the grip of the Nazi regime, while their older siblings and parents were often left to their fate in Europe. And of course, America has a much worse record. After 1945, hierarchies of race and age continued to be intertwined in European migration and asylum policies. In the face of persistent labor shortages, governments around the world began to see the refugees crowding German displaced persons camps as a potential demographic resource. But they evaluated the cultural and economic desirability of these refugees in nationalist, racial, and age-specific terms. The resettlement of these refugees ultimately became a forum for defining a post-fascist migration and citizenship policy, for debating and defining the possibilities and limits of assimilation. So, for example, of course, many Jewish refugees crowded Europe's DP camps in 1945. But Jewish adults, specifically, were not among the refugees considered desirable in the scramble for good migrants. An immediate priority of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Interior Ministry after the French liberation was actually to deport German Jewish refugees who remained on French soil. A government memo written in early October 1945 specified, quote, "It is desirable that the French government should, at the opportune moment, ask these refugees who are of no economic or demographic interest to leave our territory." But at the same time, Jewish children who had survived the Holocaust were welcomed in France because they were seen as malleable and capable of becoming French through education, as were, ironically, children born to German mothers and French fathers in occupied Germany after the war. In Czechoslovakia, meanwhile, surviving German-speaking Jews were actually expelled and deported along with other Germans after World War II. In May of 1945, the Czechoslovak Interior Ministry sent a memo to the Jewish community in Prague specifying that any Jew who had registered as a German on the 1930 census would not be considered a Czechoslovak citizen and would be subject to deportation. But here, too, age could make a difference. So Czechoslovak officials ruled that exiled Czechoslovak citizens over the age of 14 could be repatriated from Germany only if they could prove that they were Czech or Slovak and had mastered the Czech or Slovak language, and that included Jews. Orphans over the age of 8 were subject to an investigation to determine their nationality based on objective characteristics. So only certified Czechs and Slovaks were allowed to return. But orphans under the age of 8 could return to Czechoslovakia even if they were classified as Germans, Jews, or Hungarians, because Czech officials assumed that they could be assimilated and re-educated basically as Czechs. These reflected a broader European focus on selecting individuals deemed desirable or assimilable from among the masses of refugees in post-war Europe. In the words of Francis Perrin of France's new National Demography Institute, quote, "There are currently masses of available candidates for immigration in the world. Now is the moment to choose those who will be the most easily assimilable. In 2 years, it will be too late." In both East and West, then, Europeans emerged from the war convinced that only national homogeneity could prevent the outbreak of a Third World War. These convictions shaped policies of immigration in the West, as well as the wave of ethnic cleansing in the East. And they also informed asylum and immigration policies outside of Europe. So Australian authorities, for example, dreamt of populating their country with British orphans and war babies after the war. But non-white children, along with children with any kind of physical or mental handicap, were officially excluded. In the United States, the 1948 and 1950 DP Acts enabled 400,000 refugees to enter the U.S. And contained special provisions for children who, in theory, were to be privileged. The legislation specified that 30% of the so-called new Americans had to be agricultural workers, and 40% had to come from territories annexed by the USSR. So most Jewish refugees were not agricultural workers. Baltic refugees, in particular, enjoyed most favored refugee status. While visiting Germany, Congressman Frank Shelf of Kentucky praised Balts as they had, quote, "every sign of having come from good stock and good breeding." The DP Acts of 1948 and Balts were also Protestant, that was key. The DP Acts of 1948 and 1950 did ultimately permit around 100,000 Jewish DPs to enter the U.S. in spite of these restrictions, partly because aid workers on the ground interpreted these requirements somewhat liberally. But the U.S. certainly joined other countries at the time with its policies of selective humanitarianism. Across Europe, policymakers transformed the post-war refugee crisis into a demographic opportunity. And across Europe, children were seen as the most desirable migrants of all by virtue of their perceived capacity for assimilation. The rise of international adoption after World War II itself reflected these hierarchies. And actually, World War II was the moment at which international adoption first took place on a wide-scale basis. Orphans were essentially seen as the greatest prize of all because they were basically assimilable children unattached to undesirable parents. A preoccupation with recruiting assimilable migrants in order to create homogeneous nation states transcended any kind of East-West divide after the Second World War, shaping both East European policies of ethnic cleansing and West European and American migration policies. And interestingly, it cut against what was at the same time a very widespread rhetorical emphasis on the reunification of families, because at the very same time that these policies were being enacted, everybody was saying the solution to the post-war refugee crisis is to bring families back together. I would argue that the histories of humanitarianism and of ethnic cleansing in 20th century Europe are not unrelated or contradictory. By privileging the young and assimilable, European policymakers aim to craft nationally homogeneous populations under the cloak of humanitarian rhetoric. International humanitarian organizations were often complicit with these goals as they pursued the renationalization of children in the name of human rights and of children's best interests. From the Armenian genocide to the Kindertransports to the post-war resettlement of European refugees, children were not only saved from war, hunger, racial persecution, and purgatory in refugee camps because they were seen as particularly innocent or vulnerable or deserving. They were saved because they represented the biological future of nations. And they were saved to the extent that people believed that they would assimilate and serve the dream of policymakers to construct homogeneous nation states. Thank you.
Now, are you comfortable standing here?
Sure, sure. Do you want to call on people? Do you want me to?
I would be glad to call on people. And so who would like to ask a question? Oh, the Nanovic tradition is to have students ask first, which means that it could be very silent here until somebody gets up their guts. Yes, please.
Kind of conflict between the German foster parents and some of the orphans, and how there was concern over causing, more, kind of problems in these, little kids' lives by taking them away from this new family they found. I was wondering if there was any evidence of, if they did take them away, of, there were lasting effects on that, or if leaving them there had lasting effects as well.
That's a really excellent question, in part because, oddly enough, there was so much attention to this issue in this immediate moment after World War II, and then there were very few follow-up studies. I don't know of any follow-up studies specifically on those children. There were, the theories that were underpinning all of this were essentially psychoanalytic theories, Anna Freud's theories specifically, which basically stated that what really mattered for a child's emotional development and security was their attachment to their caregiver, typically mother, in very early childhood, and that bond needed to be secure. And those conclusions were drawn on the basis of observing children who had been evacuated from London during the bombings of World War II, who had been separated from their parents. And Freud basically concluded that it was far more traumatic for the children to be separated from their parents than to be exposed to violence and bombing in the cities. And this was an incredibly influential idea. So there are some follow-up studies. In the 60s and 70s, they followed up on some of the kids who had been in those nurseries from London and found that they hadn't actually suffered any long-term psychological damage. But again, I'm not sure that there's enough of kind of a corpus of evidence to make any definitive claims. And I think also as a historian, I'm not willing to kind of go there myself in terms of, well, I don't have the evidence in any event, no, for sure.
And as a
It's a good
historian, it's
question.
extremely important.
Right.
I will take another student if I can find one. I don't believe it. I don't buy it. No, you're not a student. I'm just thinking.
I'll wait.
Yeah, no. Please.
I have a question about, I think, the moral charge that I see behind this, which is one in favor of cosmopolitanism, universalism, individualism, the things that didn't happen after World War II. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about the extent to which they were in any way viable alternatives at the time. You talk about, you know, some of the people in the United Nations seem to have this, but it just didn't ever rise to the level where it could be established as policy. And I wonder if you could say something more about the possibilities that existed at the time, and whether or not you see what happened in the 40s and 50s as, I don't want to say inevitable, but as powerfully determined by what happened before, and to what extent it really was an opening to a kind of framework, I think, that you value, and that we talk about Sentiment One, and this kind of more universalistic basis for human rights that emerges in a later period.
Right. That's a really excellent question. I think you're absolutely right in some ways that, I mean, it's a bit unfair of me to judge, to judge people in the 1940s for not kind of adhering. Well, what I think I'm judging them for is not adhering to their own rhetoric rather than to my set of moral values, although I certainly have a kind of point of view here. One thing I guess I would say is that there are a lot of unintended consequences that are not part of the story that I just told, but that, for example, Martin Zahra has written about kind of, if you look at the history of the United Nations itself, the prologue of, there's all this incredibly lofty rhetoric about universal values and individualist values and so on. And Moyne makes this point as well in a way. But that, the guy who wrote the preamble was one of the authors of apartheid in South Africa. And that there, for these people who created the UN, there was no contradiction whatsoever there because they saw the United Nations in a sense as a continuation of the civilizing force of the British Empire in the world. This seems very far off from what I've just talked about, but I think what's interesting about that case is that there was this huge contradiction there, right, at the heart of the United Nations at its founding. But, people were pretty quickly onto that contradiction, and anti-colonial activists pretty quickly started using the United Nations as a forum for making their demands. So I think, in a way, that even though in many cases this sort of individualist, universalist rhetoric of these humanitarian organizations was not put into place at the moment. And I kind of just gave you, I think, a fairly pessimistic, negative, sad kind of story that it did create a rhetoric that could later be mobilized and was mobilized. And it creates a framework where people could say, well, wait, you promise us this. These are the values that you say you're going to uphold, and we're going to hold you to that. I guess one other, I don't want to go on for too long, but one other quick comment I want to make is that I don't feel that I'm always on the side of the liberal individualists in this story, because another part of this story, interestingly, is the way in which precisely those psychoanalytic theories that basically said that any child separated from his or her mother will be permanently and ruinously traumatized, supported the closing of essentially all daycares and nurseries for all women after World War II in Britain, because people observed what happened to refugee children, children in concentration camps, displaced children, and they derived conclusions about all children and their development based on those examples. So that's a case where the kind of individualist, liberal rhetoric, or familialist rhetoric of keep children with their families, they don't belong to the nation, could also kind of have adverse, and what I would see from my, very specific perspective as adverse consequences.
Somebody.
A lot of the evidence that you presented us tonight seems to be based on documents and organizations and institutions. And I wonder if you have evidence of case studies of talking to real people who've been involved in this, and if that, how does that play in?
That's a great question. I did not do oral history for this project. Arguably, I could have or should have, because many of the children that I'm talking about are still alive. I did try, you don't get it at all in the story I just told you, but I did really try to kind of get some access to the voices of children themselves and of families themselves, which I was able to do in part through these case files themselves, so social workers' files and so on and so forth, which are where they interview children and parents, in part through memoirs and oral testimonies that were collected during and after the war itself. And it's really complicated. I mean, they come down in all different places. There's no sort of universal, but what is, I think, surprising, or maybe not, if you consider the momentousness of the trauma that many of these children experienced during the war, is that many of them did not want to return to their families or to their nation of origin, and they often fought that very hard. That by the time the war ended, they'd often been separated from their families for up to 10 years, had formed new attachments either to parental figures or foster parents or to groups of other kids. And so you find a lot of cases where there's a fair amount of resistance to returning. But it's hard to get at children's voices. So it's one of the challenges of the research.
Yes.
I found your thesis very interesting about the children being spoils of war. But I wondered what you think about, for example, with the orphans of the Armenian genocide, that humanitarian agencies found it as an outrage that they had become Muslims or Islamicized. What is your feeling about the presence of missionaries at all in this region of the Ottoman Empire or Turkey? There's some thesis that they were only there to get basically Christian members to come back and work in the member countries. What do you think about that?
I think that's an excellent question that I'm not fully equipped to answer, which I don't mean as a way of avoiding it. But I think that what I'm interested in there is more the way in which the League of Nations, which itself is not supposed to be a missionary, it's supposed to be a secular, in theory it's a secular organization, adopts this idea of children as national property in a sense and sees it as a humanitarian imperative in a way to reclaim children for their religion and nationality of origin, and that sets in place a pattern that persists until the end of the Second World War. I think actually though that the question that you ask is a really good one for further research, and I think it would be really interesting to know more about the precise connections. There hasn't been a lot of research on this League of Nations group actually, and I think it would be very interesting to know a little bit more about the precise relationships between the League and the people on the ground and missionary organizations, and to the extent to which they were talking to each other, which is again also a question I can't answer. But.
Yes.
Do you think that the definition of genocide and the inclusion of, like the removal of children from their parents as part of, a definition contributed to maybe a change after World War II versus World War I?
I think, yes. I think that notion, once it was put into place, even if it wasn't ratified officially as part of the convention, has had lasting power, and it's been evoked in other contexts in Latin America with missing children, even in the cases of Aboriginal children stolen from families in Australia, for example. So it's an idea that has had staying, it's actually even been evoked in a very kind of polemical way in the cases of African American children adopted by white parents in the U.S. So this is an idea. And any time there are international, in Haiti, in Africa, whenever there are conflicts over international adoption, these kinds of terms come up again and are very powerful politically. So I think on some level we've moved a long way from 1945 and the kinds of conceptions of human rights that were formulated at that moment, but I do think that they stayed with us. And if you, there will be a next time that there is a humanitarian catastrophe somewhere and children are airlifted to France or the United States, and this kind of conflict will rise up again. So, yeah.
Thanks very much. What a fascinating analysis. I find myself wondering about something that I don't know whether you know how much you might have to say on it, but I find myself wondering about the actual behavior of administrative officials, commanding officers, or lower level military officials, maybe sometimes judges, people who weren't supposed to be making policy, but who had the opportunity to make decisions that would have real consequences for the children that you're so concerned with. And I wonder whether their decisions were fully fully reflected the ideologies and policies that you focus on, or whether they may have tended more in one direction or another, perhaps more broadly humanitarian and cosmopolitan, or maybe less so.
Right, that's an excellent question. And actually it's precisely the kind of, I've never really formulated the question in that way, but it's sort of precisely one of the reasons that I'm interested in this moment and this context, because the UN is really new. They're going to Europe. They're not that organized. They're kind of notoriously unorganized. So there are a lot of people, including, for me it's very interesting, women from Britain and America with social work degrees who, fly out to Europe in a sense for the adventure of their lives, but to do this humanitarian work, who have a lot of power in the field to make these decisions. I think there are moments where the decision-making of the people on the ground conflicts with that of the higher-ups. For example, in a way that the UN, there were certainly UN social workers on the ground who were less sympathetic to the idea of sending kids back to Eastern Europe than the official policy was, and they would create stalling tactics, like they would. One of the issues was at what age does somebody stop being a child, right? This is not at all obvious, and especially not obvious after a massive war where kids have had to grow up very fast and the boundaries are very fuzzy. So they would let them kind of wait out their time in a camp until they turned 17 and were officially allowed to make a decision on their own. But I do think that these low-level officials did shape, the ideology of the United Nations was not just, it didn't even really exist it existed in these very broad documents, but it was in effect being created on the ground in part by these kinds of low-level officials and judges, so I see it as a kind of mutual.
Okay, we have time for these two questions.
Did you uncover any systematic differences between different religious groups' perception of what should be done in cases like that? I could imagine that some religious groups might weigh the moral authority of the family differently from other groups, for example. I'm thinking particularly of different kinds of Christian groups, I suppose, and their own sense of what the right thing to do was in cases
right.
like this.
Well, one of the interesting things about this post-war scene is that only the Jewish organizations actually had the authority to go into the field and act independently with respect to Jewish refugees. There were many other religious humanitarian organizations that were active, but they all had to kind of work under the aegis of the UN, whereas the Jewish organizations were there independently, so we have a much clearer sense of their logic. I think that there was a general conception, shared particularly, I think, by Catholic and Jewish organizations, that children belonged in some sense to the community, that ideally the family and the religious community could be the same, that, yes, a Jewish child belongs in a family, but a Jewish family. So they tried to make the two go together. I'm not so sure what I can say about the various Protestant organizations, but the vast majority of refugee children were either Catholic or Jewish, actually, so it was a little less relevant there. Quakers were very active as relief, in terms of relief, but they worked with children of all faiths, so they didn't articulate specific ideas about the relationship between the faith and the family and community.
I think you mentioned people's feeling like they're part of a nationality and that the effects of that on their psychological soundness. I was wondering what you think about that. Do you think that it's important for people to feel like they're part of a nationality?
That is, I hate to say I can't answer that question because I'm a historian, but yes, obviously history teaches us that people feel it is very important to belong to a nationality. I do, yes, on some level I do think that in a world that was organized and continues to be organized along national lines, that psychologically people do have a need to very often to belong, to feel that they belong to a national group, and that pragmatically we don't live in a world where it's possible not to, in a sense. But I also think that people in this moment maybe underestimated the ability of people to belong to multiple cultures, and overestimated the negative effects that would, and underestimated the potential positive effects that it could have to speak multiple languages, to belong to multiple cultures. So, wishy-washy answer.
Well, here I want to just comment for a second. First of all, just thank you for the really provocative, wonderful presentation. I always tell my students that the sign of great scholarship is when you can define a fairly small, specific thing, which turns out not to be small, but a specific thing, and then figure out why that thing is important and how you can extrapolate what you're doing to big questions, such as people's identity, and also how we would hope to treat people, how we would hope to treat children, for example. Can I ask you quickly, why children?
Why children?
I mean, do you have a reason, or are historians for children?
Well, I don't think I do think it's a topic that people have looked at, but not maybe as much as they should. And I think why, I don't have a personal story why I'm interested, but I think what interests me about children is that it's a really fantastic way to get at the way political ideas and political changes transform everyday life and affect everyday people. Because if you look at the world, the majority of many people have children, and everybody was a child at some point. And it's a place where high politics and everyday life intersect. You can kind of understand better how a society understands itself and what visions they have for the future.
That's terrific. We have a couple items for you, and why don't you? Is this these cigars? It looks like cigars. Okay, so I'll present that to you. You may open it.
I can open it. Wow, this is beautiful. Can I show it to
Take it out and
people?
show it to people. This heavy stuff. Well, I want to just thank you for coming down here from so far away.
It was an arduous journey from 1994.
Yeah, and just sharing all these provocative thoughts with us. So congratulations, and I also want to thank the Shannons who continue to show so much generosity in Notre Dame.